The SCR-300 radio crackled against Murphy's back as he pressed himself deeper into the snow-covered foxhole, watching German silhouettes move between the frost-laden pines of the Vosges Mountains. January 1945 had turned eastern France into a frozen hell, where exhaled breath gave away positions and rifle bolts seized in the cold. The 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding forward through these forests for weeks, trading blood for ridgelines that looked identical in the grey winter light. Sergeant Martinez crawled up beside him, ice crystals clinging to his stubble. The older man's eyes held the particular exhaustion that came from too many nights listening for the crunch of boots in snow, too many dawns wondering if this would be the morning they got overrun. "Murphy, battalion's been trying to raise us for an hour. Radio's acting up again." Murphy nodded, adjusting the handset that had become his lifeline to the scattered American units across this sector. 3 days ago, it had saved them when he'd coordinated artillery strikes against a German probe. Yesterday, it had been nothing but static when they'd needed fire support most. The radio was like everything else in this war. It worked when you didn't need it and failed when your life depended on it. Through the tree line, Murphy caught sight of something that made his stomach tighten. A German Panzer IV, hull down behind a ridge, its long barrel traversing slowly across the American positions. Behind it, barely visible in the morning mist, came the methodical advance of enemy infantry. Too many of them. Far too many for 17 cold, tired GIs to stop. "How many you count?" Martinez whispered. 2 companies, maybe more. They've been watching us, figuring out our positions. The truth hung between them like the fog. Their little outpost at this crossroads village couldn't hold against what was coming. The smart play was to call for permission to withdraw, to fall back to more defensible ground before they got cut to pieces. But the radio kept feeding them fragments of desperate calls from other units, all of them asking for help that wasn't coming. Private Kowalski shifted in the foxhole to their left, his bandaged shoulder a reminder of how close the German patrols had been probing. Corporal Jenkins worked the bolt of his Browning automatic rifle, checking the action for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Good soldiers, all of them. But Murphy could see the question in their eyes. How long before someone made the call to get them out of here? Murphy picked up the radio handset, feeling its familiar weight. For months, this device had been his weapon of choice. Not the carbine slung across his back, but this electronic lifeline that connected him to artillery batteries, air support, and command posts scattered across the frozen landscape of eastern France. He'd learned to read the rhythms of radio traffic the way other soldiers read terrain, understanding that information could be as deadly as bullets when used correctly. The German attack was building like a winter storm. Murphy could feel it in the way the enemy probes had shifted, the increased chatter on their frequencies, the methodical way that Panzer IV was selecting targets. In 20 minutes, maybe less, those 2 companies would come across the open ground in organized waves. His 17 men would get one chance to break their advance, or they'd be wiped out before anyone back at battalion even knew they were in trouble. That's when Murphy made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of requesting permission to withdraw, instead of calling for the reinforcements that didn't exist, he began transmitting on every frequency he could find. His voice, usually so quiet that men had to lean close to hear him, suddenly carried across the airwaves of the Vosges Mountains with absolute clarity and conviction. He started describing positions that existed only in his imagination, calling in fire missions to coordinates he calculated by instinct rather than mathematics. The radio became his stage, and Murphy began performing the most important role of his life, commanding an American force that was 3 times larger and better positioned than the handful of exhausted soldiers actually holding this frozen crossroads. Martinez stared at him as Murphy's transmissions painted a picture of tank destroyers and artillery batteries that might or might not exist, of reinforcements moving to flanking positions that were pure tactical fiction. But the older sergeant understood what the young Texan was doing. In war, perception could matter as much as firepower. And right now, Murphy's voice was the only weapon they had that the Germans couldn't count or target. The enemy advance slowed as their commanders heard confident American radio traffic suggesting a well-coordinated defensive position. Murphy continued transmitting, his words creating a web of fictional communications that began attracting real responses from scattered units across the sector. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first German mortar rounds began falling at 800, geysers of snow and frozen earth erupting between the scattered American positions. Murphy pressed the radio handset closer to his ear, listening to the mix of real and fabricated traffic that was beginning to take on a life of its own. Units he'd never heard of were responding to his fictional coordinates, asking for clarification on orders he'd invented minutes earlier. Private Hendricks slid into the foxhole beside them, his face pale with more than cold. "Sarge, that Panzer's got us ranged. First time it opens up, we're done." Martinez nodded grimly. The German tank had been methodically registering targets for the past hour, its barrel swinging between the farmhouse ruins where half their squad was positioned and the stone wall where Jenkins had set up the bar. Once the infantry attack began, that Panzer IV would systematically destroy every position that offered organized resistance. Murphy keyed the radio again, his voice cutting through the static with practiced authority. He was coordinating fire missions that existed only in his tactical imagination, directing Phantom tank destroyers to positions that would give them clear fields of fire on the approaching German armor. But as he spoke, something unexpected began happening on the frequencies around him. Real artillery units started acknowledging his calls. An actual tank destroyer platoon, lost in the maze of forest roads since dawn, began moving toward coordinates he designated as critical. Murphy's fictional command network was becoming genuine coordination, his desperate improvisation transforming into the kind of combined arms defense that doctrine promised but rarely delivered. "Jesus, kid," Martinez whispered. "They're actually listening to you." The irony wasn't lost on Murphy. For weeks, the radio had failed them when they needed it most. Static and broken transmissions when enemy armor was bearing down. Dead air when they called for fire support. Now, when he was making up half of what he transmitted, every unit in the sector seemed to hear him clearly. The same device that had let them down so many times was about to become their salvation or their damnation. Through his binoculars, Murphy watched the German infantry begin their advance. They moved with the careful precision of veterans who'd learned to respect American firepower, but there was confidence in their formation. Their reconnaissance had probably told them this was an isolated outpost, a speed bump to be cleared, before the real offensive continued deeper into the Vosges Mountains. The morning air carried the growl of tank engines and the sharp crack of rifle bolts working in the cold. Somewhere in the forest behind the German lines, Murphy could hear NCOs shouting orders, the same tired cadence of professional soldiers getting ready to do what soldiers did. For a moment, the universal misery of winter warfare made the enemy seem less like monsters and more like cold, scared men following orders they probably questioned. But that moment of empathy vanished when the first machine gun opened up, tracers snapping overhead like deadly fireflies. The German attack was beginning in earnest, and Murphy's radio performance was about to face its ultimate test. Either his fictional command structure would materialize into real support, or 17 American soldiers would discover just how much difference one voice on the airwaves could make when everything else had already gone wrong. Kowalski's rifle cracked from the left flank, a clean shot that dropped a German pointman at 200 yards. The enemy infantry went to ground immediately, their advance slowing as they reassessed what they were facing. Murphy continued transmitting, acknowledging units that were starting to exist, coordinating movements that were becoming genuine tactics. The radio that had failed them so many times was finally working perfectly. The question was whether perfect communication would be enough to stop what was coming across that frozen field, or whether Murphy had just orchestrated the most elaborate way possible for them all to die together. Martinez chambered around in his M1 Garand and gave Murphy a look that mixed admiration with something approaching fear. "I hope you know what you're doing, Texas." Murphy hoped so too, but hope, like radio signals, had a way of fading when you needed it most. By Aero 900, Murphy's voice had become the central nervous system of American resistance across a 3-mile front in the Vosges Mountains. Radio operators from companies scattered throughout the frozen forests were using him as a relay point, trusting the calm authority in his transmissions to coordinate fire missions and troop movements they couldn't manage directly. What had started as desperate improvisation was becoming something unprecedented. A private first class conducting a combined arms defense from a foxhole. The German advance had stalled twice as their commanders tried to reconcile what their eyes told them. A handful of American positions in an undermanned village, with what their radio intercepts suggested. A well-coordinated defensive network with substantial fire support. Murphy continued transmitting position reports and fire requests, painting a picture of American strength that existed only in the electronic spectrum, but was becoming more real with each unit that responded to his calls. Sergeant Martinez moved between the scattered foxholes, checking ammunition and adjusting fields of fire. When he returned, his expression carried news Murphy didn't want to hear. "Jenkins is down to his last belt for the bar. Kowalski's running low on rifle ammo. Whatever you're doing with that radio, it better work soon." The tactical reality was brutal in its simplicity. 17 soldiers, regardless of how well they coordinated with phantom reinforcements, couldn't hold against 2 companies of German infantry supported by armor. Murphy's radio network might confuse enemy commanders and attract real fire support, but it couldn't change the mathematics of small arms ammunition or the fact that the Panzer IV was still methodically targeting their positions. A new voice crackled through the static, different from the artillery units and scattered infantry companies Murphy had been coordinating. This was a tank destroyer platoon, lost since dawn in the maze of forest roads that crisscrossed the Vosges Mountains, finally reaching coordinates Murphy had designated hours earlier based on pure tactical intuition. "Badger 6, this is Steel 2-1. We're hull down on the ridge you called. Got eyes on German armor in the valley. Request permission to engage." Murphy felt something twist in his stomach as he realized the implications. His fictional fire plan was about to become devastatingly real. The tank destroyer crew was asking permission to open fire based on coordinates he'd calculated by guesswork, targeting priorities he'd invented to maintain his radio deception. If he was wrong, American armor would waste precious ammunition on empty forest. If he was right, the next few minutes would determine whether his improvised defense could stop what was coming. "Steel 2-1, you are cleared to engage armor targets at your discretion. Priority is the Panzer IV. Grid coordinates follow." As Murphy transmitted the numbers, part of his mind marveled at what was happening. The radio that had failed them so consistently was now carrying his voice across miles of hostile territory, turning his tactical guesses into lethal reality. Other soldiers were betting their lives on his judgment, trusting a 20-year-old Texan to coordinate combined arms defense from a snow-filled hole in the ground. The tank destroyer's gun spoke with a crack that rolled across the frozen landscape like thunder. Through his binoculars, Murphy watched the German Panzer IV shudder as the armor-piercing round sparked off its glacis plate, the tank slewing sideways as its crew fought to bring their main gun to bear on this unexpected threat. The psychological effect on the advancing infantry was immediate. Soldiers who'd been moving with confidence suddenly went to ground, their neat formations dissolving as they sought cover from American armor they hadn't known existed. Private Hendricks worked the bolt of his rifle and grinned fiercely. "How the hell did you know they were out there?" Murphy didn't answer, because the truth was that he hadn't known. He'd guessed, improvised, and hoped, using the radio as both weapon and prayer. The tank destroyer crew had found their way to those coordinates through a combination of Murphy's fictional navigation and their own professional competence, arriving at exactly the moment his defense needed them most. But the German attack was far from over. Enemy infantry were regrouping, using the terrain to advance by bounds while their supporting weapons kept American heads down. Murphy continued coordinating, his voice carrying across frequencies that connected artillery batteries, isolated infantry squads, and the tank destroyers whose guns were now his primary hope of survival. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The radio crackled with new traffic. Reports of German reserves moving through the forest, requests for ammunition resupply, and the steady stream of coordinates and tactical updates that Murphy was orchestrating from his frozen command post. Somewhere in this electronic web, the line between fiction and reality had blurred beyond recognition. The tank destroyer's second shot took the German Panzer force squarely in the turret, metal ringing against metal in a sound that carried across the frozen battlefield like a church bell. Murphy watched through his binoculars as the enemy tank's crew abandoned their vehicle, small figures scrambling away from the smoking hull. But the destruction of their armor support only seemed to enrage the German infantry, who began advancing with the desperate fury of men who knew their only chance of survival lay in overrunning the American positions before more fire support arrived. Murphy's radio had become the nerve center of a battle that sprawled across miles of the Vosges Mountains. His foxhole received reports from units he'd never heard of, transmitted coordinates for fire missions he calculated by instinct, and coordinated the movements of reinforcements that materialized out of the winter forest like tactical miracles. The device that had failed them so many times was now performing flawlessly, carrying his voice to artillery batteries and tank destroyer crews who executed his orders with professional precision. But electronic warfare couldn't stop rifle bullets or the methodical advance of enemy infantry who'd finally realized they were facing a much smaller force than their radio intercept suggested. The first German soldiers reached the stone wall where Jenkins had positioned his bar, forcing the corporal to abandon his carefully prepared position and fall back toward the farmhouse ruins that anchored their defensive line. "Murphy!" Martinez shouted over the crack of rifle fire. "They're getting close. Whatever you got coming, we need it now." The radio crackled with acknowledgments from the tank destroyer crew who were traversing their gun to engage German infantry positions. Murphy could hear artillery shells whistling overhead as fire missions he'd called began impacting in the tree line, where enemy reserves were forming. His fictional command network had become devastatingly real, bringing down steel rain on coordinates he'd selected through a combination of tactical intuition and pure desperation. Private Kowalski's rifle clicked empty. The young soldier fumbled for a fresh clip, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline as German machine gun fire chewed bark from the tree trunk that sheltered him. Murphy could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the recognition that ammunition was running low and enemy infantry were advancing faster than American fire support could stop them. That's when Murphy made the decision that would transform him from coordinator to combatant. Setting down the radio handset, he grabbed his carbine and began moving between the scattered American positions, not to direct fire support, but to fight with the intimate precision that only came from seeing your target clearly and knowing that 17 lives depended on every round you fired. The German attack reached its climax in a series of individual firefights scattered across the frozen village. Murphy moved through this tactical maze like a man who could see patterns invisible to others, appearing exactly where the enemy pressure was greatest, his carbine cracking with methodical accuracy. He'd spent months coordinating battles from a distance, but now he was fighting with his hands and eyes, reading the flow of combat with an intimacy that no radio frequency could provide. Jenkins's bar hammered from a new position as the corporal found an angle that enfiladed the advancing German infantry. Artillery shells continued falling in the tree line, disrupting enemy reserves before they could reinforce the assault. The tank destroyer's gun cracked again, its high-velocity rounds shattering trees and sending German soldiers scrambling for cover. But it was Murphy's rifle that made the difference. Moving between positions with almost supernatural timing, he appeared wherever the defense was about to crack, his shooting so precise that enemy soldiers began hesitating before crossing open ground. The radio had coordinated the battle, but Murphy's carbine was winning it, one carefully aimed shot at a time. As the German attack finally broke and enemy soldiers began withdrawing toward the tree line, Murphy returned to his radio, keying the handset with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. His voice, when it came through the static, carried the same calm authority that had been coordinating fire missions all morning. All stations, this is Badger 6. Enemy attack repulsed. Continuing to monitor sector. In the silence that followed the German withdrawal, Murphy sat beside his radio and finally understood what he'd actually done. The after-action reports would describe a successful coordinated defense, crediting multiple units with repelling an enemy assault through superior communications and fire support. But Murphy knew the truth that would never appear in any official document. For 6 hours, he'd commanded a battle by creating a fictional army that somehow became real. The central secret wasn't his marksmanship during the final assault, though his shooting had been devastatingly accurate. It wasn't even his ability to coordinate artillery and tank destroyer fire from scattered units across the Vosges Mountains. The secret was that Murphy had won by lying, by transmitting position reports for units that didn't exist, coordinating fire plans based on tactical intuition rather than reconnaissance, and creating the radio signature of an American force 3 times larger than the 17 exhausted soldiers actually holding the line. Sergeant Martinez approached the foxhole, his expression carrying a mixture of admiration and something approaching unease. Battalion finally got through on the radio. They want to know how we coordinated with all those support units. Apparently, half the artillery fires you called came from batteries that weren't supposed to be monitoring our frequency. Murphy stared at the radio handset, realizing the full implications of what he'd orchestrated. Tank destroyer crews had abandoned their assigned sectors to respond to his calls for fire support. Artillery batteries had diverted ammunition from other missions to strike targets he'd designated through pure guesswork. Infantry companies had altered their movement plans to conform to the tactical picture he'd painted through his fictional transmissions. The victory had been real, but it was built on a foundation of electronic deception that could have resulted in court-martial charges if anyone chose to examine his methods too closely. Murphy had saved 17 American lives by commandeering radio frequencies, misdirecting support units, and creating unauthorized command relationships across multiple companies and battalions. In the rigid hierarchy of military communications, what he'd done was either brilliant improvisation or serious insubordination, depending on who was conducting the investigation. Private Kowalski appeared with a steaming cup of coffee, liberated from the supply truck that had finally reached their position. The young soldier's hands had stopped shaking, but his eyes still carried the particular brightness that came from surviving something that should have killed you. How'd you know where all those tank destroyers were? How'd you get the artillery to respond so fast? Murphy accepted the coffee and realized he couldn't explain what he'd done without admitting to the deception that made it possible. The official version would credit excellent communications and coordinated fire support. The reality was that he'd turned the radio into a weapon of mass tactical fiction, creating an electronic illusion so convincing that it materialized into actual fire support. Jenkins approached from the farmhouse ruins, his bar slung across his shoulder and his expression thoughtful. "That radio work you did, I've never seen anything like it. You were talking to units from 3 different battalions, coordinating fires like you had the whole sector wired. But some of those transmissions—" The corporal's voice trailed off, but Murphy could see the question in his eyes. Jenkins had been monitoring radio traffic long enough to recognize when communications didn't follow normal protocols. He'd heard Murphy coordinating with units that shouldn't have been monitoring their frequency, directing movements for reinforcements that arrived with suspicious timing, and calling in fire missions that were answered faster than standard procedure allowed. The radio continued crackling with traffic from across the sector, units reporting successful missions and requesting new coordinates. Murphy's voice had become a trusted reference point for scattered American forces throughout the Vosges Mountains, but he alone understood how much of that trust was built on tactical improvisation masquerading as professional competence. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the frozen battlefield, Murphy made a decision that would shape how he remembered this day for the rest of his life. When the official debriefing came, he would describe successful coordination with supporting units. He would credit excellent radio communications and timely fire support. He would never mention that his most effective weapon had been an electronic lie so convincing that it became tactical truth. The secret would stay with him, along with the knowledge that sometimes saving lives required breaking rules that existed for good reasons. 3 hours after the German withdrawal, a jeep arrived carrying a lieutenant colonel from regimental headquarters who wanted to understand how a single squad had coordinated such an effective defense. Murphy sat beside his radio, listening to the officer's questions and providing answers that were technically accurate but incomplete. Yes, they'd maintained communications with supporting units. Yes, the fire support had been timely and effective. No, he couldn't explain why so many scattered units had responded to their calls for assistance. The first twist came when the lieutenant colonel revealed that Murphy's radio network had actually improved coordination across the entire sector. Units that had been operating in isolation for days were now talking to each other, sharing intelligence, and coordinating movements through the communication web Murphy had created. His fictional command structure had evolved into genuine tactical cooperation that was making the whole front more effective. "Son," Martinez heard the colonel say, "whatever you did today, keep doing it. Half the units in this sector are requesting to maintain communications through your position." But the second twist was darker. As evening approached, reports began filtering in from other parts of the front. German commanders, frustrated by their failure to break through what their intelligence had identified as a weak point, had redirected their offensive pressure elsewhere. 2 miles south, an isolated company was being overrun by the armor and infantry that Murphy's deception had turned away from his own position. His tactical fiction had saved 17 American lives while potentially dooming dozens of others. Murphy stared at the radio as these reports came through, understanding for the first time that every victory in war cast shadows somewhere else. The tank destroyers that had saved his position weren't available to support other units. The artillery fires he'd called had consumed ammunition that other companies needed for their own survival. His successful defense had created tactical ripple effects that would influence battles he'd never see, fought by soldiers whose names he'd never know. Sergeant Martinez found him still sitting beside the radio as darkness fell across the Vosges Mountains. The older man's expression carried the particular exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have been impossible. "You did good today, Murphy. Whatever else happens, you kept us alive." But Martinez's voice carried an undercurrent of something else, recognition that the quiet Texan had revealed capabilities that were both impressive and unsettling. Other soldiers might follow orders and execute standard tactics, but Murphy had demonstrated an ability to reshape entire battles through force of will and tactical imagination. That kind of capability came with responsibilities that went beyond normal military hierarchy. As the supply trucks brought ammunition and hot food, Murphy finally set down the radio handset that had been his weapon and shield for 12 hours. His voice was hoarse from continuous transmission, his hands cramped from working frequency dials, but his mind was already processing lessons that would influence every battle he fought for the rest of the war. The radio continued crackling with traffic from units across the sector, soldiers' voices cutting through static to report positions, request supplies, and coordinate movements through the network Murphy had created. Some of those voices belonged to men who were alive because his fictional army had materialized into real fire support. Others belonged to soldiers who might die tonight because the resources they needed had been diverted to answer Murphy's unauthorized calls for assistance. 20 years later, Murphy would sit in a Dallas hotel room, listening to winter wind against the windows and remembering the weight of the radio handset on that January afternoon in the Vosges Mountains. The Medal of Honor citation would describe his actions in clean, heroic language that captured nothing of the moral complexity he carried. Official historians would analyze his tactics and coordination, but none of them would understand the central truth, that sometimes saving lives required becoming the kind of person you never planned to be. The radio static had become a permanent sound in Murphy's memory, an electronic whisper that reminded him of the day when his voice had commanded phantom armies and real consequences across miles of frozen forest. In quiet moments, when the civilian world felt impossibly distant from the weight of what he remembered, Murphy could still hear those frequencies crackling with the voices of soldiers who trusted him to guide them through chaos that none of them had been trained to survive. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.